striking cinematic experience of insanity and isolation and creeping horror and the breakdown of social structures, right? There's so much more going on there that replaces what was lost, more or less.
Yeah, so now I think let's move maybe to a more faithful adaptation that is still successful in movie form. And I think two that would stand out to me were The Shawshank Redemption and Stand By Me. Both critically successful films and both unusual and successful short stories, or novellas, I guess, by Stephen King.
Mm-hmm.
So what's your interpretation on those movies?
Well, I haven't read either of the books.
Well, yeah, but
so
on
that's
the movies.
my interpretation is both of these are very straightforward, dramatic, cinematic exercises, and they're both good movies. And it's hard for me to speak to them in terms of them being adaptations, because I really just view both of them as films. So
maybe I would just think about it with the knowledge that the idea that's being captured on the screen is basically the same as what's in the book. So why do you think that is successful in those movies where it wasn't as successful in Pet Sematary?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good question. I think that the story in Stand By Me is one that is tried and true in terms of its effectiveness on screen. It's the youthful journey of childhood friends coming of age. It's like this transformative, like, road trip story almost, where you have the inner transformation of the characters being mirrored by their physical journey, right? That is a formula that works very well on screen because it naturally lends itself to the visual elements, the physical journey, mirroring the psychological experience.
Yeah, it's almost like it was primed for a movie adaptation. I don't know when this was written, but he had already had movie adaptations made, so maybe he had that in mind when he was writing it. I don't know.
Maybe so. And also maybe just, some stories are naturally better suited for film adaptation than others and require less tinkering to work.
Yeah, and I think what's nice about both is that they both lend well to a dialogue-heavy write, less about the visual horror or visual elements of what's going on, and more about character interactions.
Yeah, and I think that is something that is very important to note, that neither of these is a horror film.
Exactly.
Sometimes the failings of the horror adaptations is that they get so wrapped up in depicting the visual horror of King's novels and then neglect what makes King's novels so effective. Whereas here, there is no striking visual horror that the films feel compelled to adapt. All there is the characters and the interactions and the transformations of the characters themselves to make the film compelling. So there's nothing to get hung up on. Like, it's more apparent what needs to be adapted.
Yeah, definitely. There's a couple elements that I think only Stephen King could have come up with, like the overarching idea in Stand By Me that they're going to find a child's body, right?
Yeah.
And yet the elements in the book that he was writing about were something that we've already seen in movies, something that we've already read about in books, right? And I think recognizing that is the key to unlocking pretty much every good Stephen King novel, that it's nothing particularly groundbreaking, but it's a slight or a new way of saying the same good stories that we like to tell, right? The same way of telling mostly horror stories, but also the same way of telling coming-of-age stories and redemption stories.
So that brings us very naturally to the fusion of the horror story and the coming-of-age story that prompted this whole episode to begin with, which is It. How do we feel like the 2017 adaptation of It does? Do we feel that the 2017 It was an effective adaptation according to the criteria we've established so far?
Yes, and I think in this case, it was essential to alter what they altered from the book.
And what did they alter from the book?
So the main differences are, like we said, this is retreading the same idea of same basic premise, same ideas of what happens, basically the same plot line, but what is completely changed is the time period, the dialogue, and also some of the character backgrounds and the way it's set up. If you know anything about the book It is one of his most epic in some ways and excessive in others. It's a 2-part It's basically two novels in one, where the first half is set in 1957, I think. It's 1958, sometime in the late 50s, and is the first half set then when they're all children, all the characters are children, and the second half is set in the present at the time, which was the 80s, when they're all adults. To update that, whereas the book is set partially in the past, which at the time was the 1950s, and in the present, that was the 1980s. For the updated version, the movie, we get the past being the 80s, and the present is the literal present of the 2010s. With that update, we get all of the changes associated with changing the time period. We get much less racism. We get
explicit racism.
Explicit racism. We get changed dialogue and also changed scares, because in the 1950s, there was a lot of focus on the classic monsters of the screen, like Frankenstein and Wolfman. That was a lot of what we got as what was scaring the children at the time. And now in the movie adaptation, we get a more liberal approach of using what is generally specifically scaring each of them, that's less nostalgic, media centric, and more about their personal insecurities.
Right. And I think that really what's most important here is just the attention that's paid to the importance of the time jump, feeling like when the book came out, the late 50s nostalgia, quote unquote, was on the same magnitude, I guess you could say, as the nostalgia that we have present day.
Definitely.
For the 1980s, right? So the experience of reading that book when it first came out is sort of emulated by the film, and the experience is thus made perhaps as faithful as it possibly could have been, even though it's updated, right? Like, it would have been a less effective adaptation had they stuck to the original time periods, because the time jump is important.
Yeah,
I think more for bringing you into the present than it is bringing you into the 80s.
Yeah, right? Instead of the jumping between two completely random times, we're getting that feel of past and present. Because if we're missing the present, it's just another past. If we're seeing it between the 50s and the 80s, viewing that in the 2010s.
Right. So in this case, the adapters noticed the need to alter the original content of the book in that way, as opposed to being held firmly to it.
Yeah, and I think that's a key thing also about the feeling captured in a coming-of-age story. It's the feeling of having been in the past as a child and having been in the present as an adult, right? That loss of innocence experienced at the time, changing from childhood to adulthood, and now we're years and years past that as an adult, just currently experiencing life.
We'll see whether the adaptation continues to be successful when the second chapter releases. But it's, so far, the experience was preserved despite the fact that the timelines aren't as interwoven as they are in the book.
Right.
Which you can speak to more than I can.
Yeah, so rather than any kind of jumping back and forth like they do in the book, we're getting an explicit cut right down the middle for the movie adaptation, a completely in the past and completely in the present viewing,
which is perhaps more straightforward, and we'll see if it loses something in the translation there. I wouldn't say that the first It was an especially inspired adaptation. It was certainly effective, I think, in translating what was in the novel into a fun horror movie extravaganza. But I'm not sure whether it holds up in terms of it being a reading of the book by a filmmaker. Like, do you view the first It chapter as like a particular reading or an imbuing of something more? Like, does it add anything to the It conversation?
I think it is kind of its own thing now. I think it's kind of its own entity because of all those changes. Yes, exactly. It is. Because of all those changes, and there's other supernatural weirdness that's taken out of the movie and turned into a more visually captivating experience rather than purely psychological, purely about the essence of fear and that mental overcoming of your fear, right? Because that's, same case with all of these adaptations we talked about. There's the element in the books of hearing thoughts, seeing that slow transformation thanks to an omnipotent view, whereas in the movie we get a more literal sense of what's going on. And I thought it actually translated well into a good reading of them partially overcoming their fear, right? At the end, we literally get them beating the clown, right? We literally are beating it, and they're defeating their fear, at least temporarily. Whereas in the book, it's more hard to explain. It would have been very difficult to put on screen. So I thought all of those changes ultimately led to making its own thing, and it worked pretty well for me because it kind of just felt like a classic horror movie, right? With classic scares, not having to be gory, but still scary enough to be rated R. That's probably from language mostly, but, still with enough freaky visuals and freaky tension building scenes that made it worthwhile.
Yeah. So the common thread that we can trace through all of these adaptations, all of the effective adaptations at least, I think, is the idea that some artistic license is necessary in order to effectively adapt a Stephen King novel in most cases. I think, it requires the filmmakers imbuing the base story laid out by the author with their own interpretations, their own readings with unique themes, or it requires shifting the focus of the narrative to something that can be effectively conveyed cinematically.
At the very least.
At the very least. Bare minimum.
Yeah. Yeah, I think the legacy of these adaptations, the strongest ones we see have their own filmmakers' interpretations or filmmakers' understanding or reading of the book.
Yeah. That is something that I don't think is exclusive to the realm of Stephen King adaptations.
Definitely not.
Can think of several contemporary examples of literary adaptations that do similar things and get similar results.
So what were you going to say last night about The Godfather, right? You mentioned that the story of The Godfather movie being made is a fairly interesting story.
Yeah, there is just to do a fellow podcast shout out, Malcolm Gladwell's podcast, Revisionist History, the episode that came out a couple weeks ago, Chutzpah versus Chutzpah. My dad told me to listen to it, and it has some really interesting history regarding the early production of the first Godfather film and how it was adapted from this novel by Mario Puzo that was actually not especially well regarded in terms of its literary merit, and it was considered a lower priority project in the gangster genre, which Hollywood bigwigs kind of thought was played out. And it was tossed to this new producer whose only previous experience producing was in television, not in film.
Gotcha.
There's a lot more to the story than this, but suffice to say that The Godfather is a preeminent example of artistic license being taken in the case of adapting a story from a book and imbuing it with a whole lot more than what was originally present.
Gotcha.
Which is something I can't speak to in that specific case because I haven't read the book.
Yeah, neither have I.
But obviously, The Godfather is an incredibly rich film that we could have a podcast dedicated easily, entirely to just talking about The Godfather.
Yeah. Yeah, another one that comes to mind, I don't know the details of it, but in terms of becoming its own entity like The Godfather and to some extent The Shining, becoming its own cultural phenomenon is One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, wouldn't you say? Because there's a subculture surrounding Ken Casey's books and also around the film itself, right? They're really regarded as two distinct things, both having their own different merits.
Yes, definitely.
And allegedly, the author of the book did not like the movie. So another case of that.
Right. Where the authors are perhaps hesitant to see their creations morphed to fit the priorities of another artist. Which
yeah, that makes sense.
It does make sense. I mean, you can kind of relate to it. It's like watching someone, in your eyes, maybe bastardize your work and twist it up to convey ideas that they have with regard to their interpretations of the work.
Plus, as is the nature of book to movie adaptation, you're distilling hours upon hours of experience into maximum 2 hours.
Yeah, certainly. And for viewers with no personal stake in the matter, I think that is typically the most fruitful method of adaptation, the heavy alteration route, just simply because it allows for what we've been talking about, for that artistic license that is very often what makes a great film, right? Is just that the ability of a great filmmaker or great filmmakers to be creative.
Yeah. And speaking of which, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest is kind of related to The Shawshank Redemption in a way, and also The Mist, because in The Mist and Shawshank Redemption and other Stephen King books and a lot of other books and One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, they're all told from one person's point of view. That is shifted creatively in movies to a more omniscient point of view, right? Not just seeing it, the things surrounding the main character, but also jumping around to different characters' point of views.
Yep.
In One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, they wisely focus on the rebellious new inmate to the ward. And with Jack Nicholson's performance and all, it just made perfect sense to focus the majority of film on that, rather than the silent Native American character who, in the book, is telling the story through his own eyes. So instead of seeing his vision of what's going on, we're seeing just the events unfold and all the characters' interactions, which is the same in The Mist and Shawshank Redemption, to varying degrees of success.
Yes, great point. And then on the more extreme end of the artistic license spectrum, you have, like we were talking about, The Shining being the preeminent Stephen King example. One recent cinematic example that comes to mind for me is Annihilation, the 2018 science fiction movie directed by Alex Garland, the director of Ex Machina. Annihilation, a bit of an overlooked film, in my opinion. It is an adaptation of a novel by Jeff Vandermeer that I believe was written in 2014, so pretty quick turnaround on that too.
Yeah.
Vandermeer's novel really revels in this idea of incomprehensible biology and exploring material that cannot be comprehended if you are viewing it through the lens of a modern human being, more or less, right? It's about the incomprehensibility of physical objects and the possibility of other forms of being and experience that are just completely different in a way that cannot be grasped by
and it's told in a very like scientifically lensed way, right?
It is, right?
There's a lot of jargon, I assume.
Main character is a biologist, and she is sort of obsessed with watching nature's machinery working without any outside intervention by humans, and just sort of so there's a lot of observational description in the novel. The film takes the same premise as the novel, but draws some of the attention away from the specifics of the biology and that lens, and instead focuses on the mental experiences of the characters and experiences of depression and intense emotional trauma that all of the characters in the film share. And it takes the same premise, but ultimately does something very different with it, and is much more about the psychology of its characters than about the physicality of Area X, which is the alien space that drives the narrative of both the film and the book. And it does so to great effect, I think. Annihilation, the book, and Annihilation, the movie, are both very different animals. I think which you prefer is down a lot to your preferences in terms of, which subject matter you find more interesting. But the film does a wonderful job of using this same jumping off point and imbuing it with Alex Garland's reading of the book, more or less,
new lens.
A new lens.
Yeah, I can see that. Yeah, the movie is very good. Like it a lot. So, yeah. Is the book worth reading?
Yeah, the book's definitely worth reading. And I read the book after I saw the film, and it was a really interesting experience because you see the reflections. You can totally chart the inspiration.
Yeah, and the visual aspect, right?
The visual aspect, they're like, it's certainly inspired. The film owes a tremendous debt to the book, and yet it is a completely unique animal. Different animal.
That actually relates more than I would have expected to what I wanted to say about the adaptation of American Psycho. Kind of like feminist reading that I was talking about from Mary Herron's direction and interpretation of it. Like Annihilation, visually similar, and like the same overarching events happen, but with very different meaning and interpretation, like a very different lens viewed on it. So rather than hearing the like psychotic thoughts of this man drawn into Wall Street life while simultaneously brutally and very explicitly and graphically murdering women and men, but more so women, that element of man's relationship to woman is more focused on, I thought, in the movie. And so we get an entirely different understanding of the overarching concepts that you can put onto what American Psycho is trying to say, right? We can see a little bit of what she was trying to interpret about misogyny and the self-absorption of men in general, whereas the book was more of almost shock value, right? Like even Bret Easton Ellis said that he actually was in such a dark place writing it that he had similar thoughts to the character, which
concerning.
Which is very concerning. But from his point of view, that was how he was viewing that, you know, Wall Street life, or at least, you know, more just general American life and interpretation at the time. Whereas instead,
like late stage capitalism, like, you know, no feeling.
His obsession with Donald Trump. That's the only person that Bateman or whatever. Bateman, Patrick Bateman. Bateman. He's obsessed with Donald Trump and reviles everyone else in the book. So
we could do a whole nother episode about films that mention or feature Donald Trump and his image, particularly that came out before he was elected president, and how those films are just fundamentally altered forever now.
Yeah, exactly. My favorite, I think, is Home Alone 2.
Oh God, yeah, Trump Tower, right?
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. I don't know what to think about.
We're gonna have a whole episode.
Exactly,
on Home Alone
that'll
2.
come.
A two-parter, actually. Just so much to discuss in that film. Three-parter for Home Alone 2, Lost in New York.
And we'll make the number of parts for however many Home Alone movies there were. Weren't there like 3 or 4?
Four,
yeah.
Maybe even 5, actually.
Jeez. Okay. God. Let's move on now.
Yeah, let's move on. Yeah, well, I actually have to move on, I think, out of this country here. Is there anything else you wanted to touch upon before we call this discussion wrapped?
I'm pretty good, I think. What I wonder, speaking of adaptations, is there any that come to mind where you've read the book and seen the movie and like the movie more than the book? Or think it's better, even?
I think that the film Annihilation is better than the book. But
interesting, okay.
I am not... I'm also, I think, I'm not sure how much that's affected by which one you consume first, to be honest. And I saw the movie first, like I said. But I think that there are examples of it. Like, I'm sure people have made cases for The Shining. I'm guessing that some of the more acclaimed King adaptations on it, like Carrie as well, probably has had arguments made for it. But that is a very interesting topic on its own right, like film adaptations that surpass the source material.
Yeah.
The Godfather.
Well, but yeah, I haven't read The Godfather, so I can't confirm that. I'm just going to assume that it's true.
Mm-hmm. Maybe if anyone listening to this has an example they'd like to throw out there, I would really love to consider exploring this topic more in the future, maybe doing an episode on it down the line.
And we'd like to debate you on that.
Yes, we love arguing. I think we should get a little bit more arguing going in this podcast, you know?
Yeah, we were fairly
disagreement.
Yeah.
Yeah. We'll be at each other's throats a little more in future weeks.
Yeah, on Ready or Not, we have some different opinions, so maybe if we do that one.
That'd be awesome. We wanted to record that for this last week, but we were just too busy with life, so down the line, we're thinking of doing some kind of 2019 retrospective series that would maybe allow us to touch upon some movies that we didn't get a chance to talk about already.
All of our favorites.
Yeah. Well, that about wraps up our discussion of Stephen King adaptations and what makes a good literary adaptation tick. If you have any thoughts, anything you think we didn't touch upon that is important in determining whether a film adaptation is effective, then hit us up on those comments. Love to hear it.
Yeah, definitely.
I'll be excited to see It Chapter 2 also. Maybe we could do a follow-up bonus episode or something where we talk about whether It Chapter 2, like whether it is tied up and is an effective adaptation as a whole.
Yeah, I'm very interested to see what they do because it looks good from the trailers, but you never know for certain.
Yeah.
Is it getting good reviews?
I don't think it's had any early reviews out yet.
We'll be seeing them this week, though.
Yeah, we will. So stay tuned.
Actually, by the time this releases, it'll already be out.
Probably so. Yeah. So you're living in the future, guys.
Yeah. enjoy the movie. We probably will, hopefully.
Yeah.
Hope it's good.
And thanks for listening to us.
Yeah. Hit us up, likes, comments, subscribe. The next time.
We'll be back soon as I'm back. I think we'll be back in late September.
Yeah. We'll be hitting you up with high quality stuff until then, but
yeah don't tune out because we're gonna keep coming at you.
Yes, consistency is the key.
It's key. That's what my mom always said.
So have a good time in Europe.
Thank you very much. You have a good time in America, and everyone listening, have a good time wherever you're at.
Let's
just all have good times.
That one dude in Australia, have a good time.
Thank you, Australian listener. You're really expanding our global reach.
Yes, thank you.
Appreciate it.
Okay.
Goodbye, everyone.
Bye. Fade out music.